Often, art in comics is seen as something simplistic, cartoony, and even juvenile. But for one cartoonist in the 20th century, painters and classical illustrators were far more influential on his art. Meanwhile, his writing imitated courtly literature. The product was Prince Valiant, a medieval tapestry come to life on the newspaper pages. Today on Truth, Beauty, Comics.
Welcome to Truth, Beauty, Comics. I'm Levi, cartoonist.
I'm Felix, the guy who likes comics.
And I'm Jordan Holt, an illustrator and an art professor.
And this is the podcast where we look for transcendence in a pulpy medium. Today we'll be talking about the first year of Prince Valiant comics by Hal Foster. And I guess you may have noticed there's a third person here. So welcome, Jordan. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, happy to have you on board today. Maybe just real quick, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you're working on, and your interest maybe in Prince Valiant.
I'm a art professor. Foremost, I started teaching at a university when I was ripe age of 24, doing graphic design because I had left school and gone into the graphic design field, but I was looking to get into illustration. So I started grad school when I was doing graphic design work, entered into teaching, which was something I always had a passion for. And then around the time we hit 2020 and all teaching went online, I started drawing comics, which is something that I had always liked, but never really pushed myself into. I was mostly doing commercial illustration and things prior to that, kind of running a side business while I teach. And I started off with a Greek mythology one called Theseus, which is still ongoing, in fact, just wrapping up. And now I'm working on the development of a medieval piece, which is the one that I hope is going to be my magnum opus. It's the one that I'm kind of putting all my sort of thoughts and hopes into. And Prince Valiant was a big inspiration point for it, mostly in the artwork and something we'll probably talk about later, the pure sincerity of it. It's extremely sincere. And that combination of things really drew me to attempting to study, especially the artwork and a little bit of the storytelling methodology of Hal Foster.
Interesting. Well, that'll be very interesting to talk about. Yeah, I can vouch. Highly recommend Theseus Volume 1 and 2. Your Greek mythology work. It's a favorite in our family. We've read it.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's very funny. If you think Greek mythology is not fun, it definitely is.
And I discovered Jordan's work through his YouTube videos because he also makes excellent sort of breakdowns of things in animation, art history. I think I first discovered him because I was watching through every sort of over the garden wall video essay that I could find, and his is one of the best. So I highly recommend those as well, in addition to his comic.
Yeah, it's a shame that this is not a film. This is a comics podcast because I could spend a lot of time talking about Over the Garden Wall. It's you could devote a whole
obviously
a whole podcast to that. Yeah, it's fantastic.
But to kind of get started on Valiant, so I'd be interested to hear kind of everybody's background with Valiant. So I might kick it to Jordan first. So, you talked about a little bit about how you've been inspired by it, but what was your kind of familiarity with it? Is it something you really loved as a kid or came to later or what?
It's honestly pretty low. It was something that was in the newspaper when I was a kid, because obviously that was still when newspapers would get passed around and I would read the funnies. And to be honest, I skipped all of the serialized ones like that. I went just for the ones that were jokes. So I was aware that it was in there and I was aware that it had good artwork, but I didn't really think about it very much. And when I started just kind of surfing around on social media collecting illustrators, I saw images from Prince Valiant being put up relatively frequently here and there, among especially those who post things like old images of classic comics or something like that. And the artwork was so high quality that it sent me kind of looking to figure out exactly how he drew, how Foster drew, and how what his process looks like, I suppose. And it's kind of hard to find information on that is one thing. But as I've studied the artwork, I've learned a great deal about his commitment to a kind of illustrative realism. And so that was kind of the thing that drew me to it. And then as I started reading it, I mentioned the sincerity before. It's just so unabashedly happy and adventurous, which is, and even though it has notes of tragedy in it, right? So it's got even in the section we're talking about, it's got these tragic elements, but it's so much like watching, what's the films of that time, like Jason and the Argonauts or something like that. It is a high flying Hollywood adventure from the 90s, is very much what it feels like. Even the way the shots are composed, etc.
Yeah, my story with it is sort of similar because I love the Sunday funny pages. And when I was, so I was a fairly early reader, but for whatever reason, it was just the tradition that on Sundays I would bring the funny pages to Dad and sit on his lap, and then he would read them to me, probably until I was like 11. But half the time I would ask him to skip Prince Valiant because it was just so wordy and boring, and it was never funny, and I just wasn't really interested in it. Then, sort of later on as an adult, when I was kind of getting back into comics and started writing about comics, I kept hearing people reference Prince Valiant as this just sort of unique work, really deeply influential, and really excellent. So I was like, okay, I'll write something on Prince Valiant. I'll read the first few years, and so I picked up the Fantagraphics volumes and was just amazed. I mean, and I was also, I think I was similarly impacted by the sort of sincerity of it because growing up, so figures like C.S. Lewis, right, and a lot of these kind of for lack of a better term, like Christian restorationists, will talk about the need to kind of cultivate a sort of sacramental imagination in the child, or a kind of medieval imagination, or whatever. And I did not really have that as a kid. I mean, I grew up relatively devout, but I was always much more pulled towards sort of science fiction works, which if often have a kind of atheistic tendency to them. And I tended to find sort of fantasy generally and like medieval stories kind of boring. And as I've aged and sort of through Tolkien and others, I've kind of come back to these things and have a love for them now. And I think I'd been sort of as an adult looking for this kind of medieval sort of Arthurian story. And Hal Foster's work just really gave that to me. And I think I was first attracted to the sort of sincerity because the art is good in the first couple of years, but it really sort of takes off and becomes just this astonishing thing a few years in. But from, the first or second week, it is telling this really human story of Val that for whatever reason, I just never connected with reading, sort of in the 90s and 2000s. But yeah, it just sort of pulled me in. So, and that also, I think, in sort of, so I read there's this excellent biography of Foster by Brian M. Kane called Hal Foster, Prince of Illustrators, Father of the Adventure Strip. And it's one of my favorite sort of cartoonist biographies. And I think reading that helped me also become a lot more interested in kind of children's illustration because Foster was really influenced by like a lot of pre-Raphaelite painters and sort of people who are doing like romantic visions of like courtly love and things, but he was also really influenced by these 19th and early 20th century children's illustrators whose work I'd always sort of known from books I had, but like had never really engaged with seriously, like Arthur Rackham or someone like that. And I think becoming familiar with Foster also kind of has sent me down that rabbit hole as well. And just like, I think Foster can be really fruitful for thinking about how we engage with the imagination and like help people to have a sort of innate sense of honor and just that and the kind of like fittingness of doing things in a beautiful way, if that makes sense. Yeah. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling now, but that's sort of my general like background with him. Levi?
Yeah, I mean, growing up as a kid in the 90s, Prince Valiant was in my, and I've been loving newspaper comics. I think it was a weird time if that's kind of when you came to a lot of these classic comics because they were certainly not in their heyday, and they, either the artists had long since handed them off to other people, they were shrunk down artistically, they were really diminished, or in cases like Peanuts, Charles Schultz was in his 70s or and not at his peak by any stretch of the imagination. So they were all kind of the ground blazing classic comics like Prince Valiant were kind of pale shadows of their former selves. And for me, I think that was kind of the same experience as you. I was like, Prince Valiant kind of sucks. It was just like not impressive. Whereas something like Calvin and Hobbes was
Yeah.
an artist kind of at the peak of their game doing really cool artistic stuff in the newspaper. So I kind of gravitated more towards that, Berkeley Breeds, Bloom County, things along those lines that were really kind of peaking at that point. But I think because of that, I was never really exposed to what Prince Valiant was when it began and in its early days. Because unlike, say, something like Peanuts, which is really easy to find collections of, just in your thrift store, you go and there's collections of the peak years of Peanuts, which is like, the 60s through the 70s. And Calvin and Hobbes, everyone buys you that for your birthday or Christmas when you're a kid, those collections. Prince Valiant, I think Fantagraphics, there's been some attempts at collecting it, but I think Fantagraphics is really the first one that did it justice. I will say, though, if you have the library of the Smithsonian collection of newspaper comics that appears in most public libraries, they do have some Prince Valiant, a few pages in there that are really stunning for me as a kid. I would read that and go, wow, like Prince Valiant used to be something special, and it ended up getting reduced. But that was about my exposure to it. I think I'm probably the latest to this. I think in preparation for this podcast is when I really started revisiting Prince Valiant, at least in its pristine original form.
And it might be worth talking about the form a little bit before we kind of get to the story and the art, because this, we talked about Crazy Cat a couple months ago, and it, I think, similarly is just like a difficult comic to come to for different reasons, but some of the same. One of which is the sheer like size of it, and therefore the difficulties that come with trying to do reprints. Because, you two are the artists, you can probably speak to this better, but Foster was working at a sort of massive scale. Right? Even a Sunday cartoonist now gets, a few inches basically. Whereas each Prince Valiant comic was printed basically on one half of a news sheet, right? So a whole page of a newspaper. And, when you look at these first, like, I think it's about the first 20 or so years of Prince Valiant, they're all just these like gorgeous, massive things that I wish I had in the original. There are people who spend thousands and thousands of dollars collecting all the original Valiant strips in newspaper form so that they have it in the sort of largest possible printing. The Fantagraphics editions, I think, do a really excellent edition because they're huge books. They're probably about 16 inches tall, 17, something like that. And quite wide. But that means that they're big enough to be readable comfortably, and that like you can really engage with the art, and you do get kind of some of that like experience of being a kid in the 30s poring over a newspaper page. Yeah, I don't know, because you two are both active artists, so I'd be interested to hear kind of what you make of the sheer size of these pages and sort of the amount that Foster's able to do with it.
It's one of the things that in questioning, what size do I want to draw in for my own graphic novel work, his pages are indicative of something that every illustrator is aware of. If you draw really big and then you scale down for printing, then a lot of your mistakes just vanish. They disappear into the ether and no one ever notices them, which is why I love to draw really big, and why when I do like an exhibition or something, I want to put a piece of tape on the floor that says they can't walk any closer than this, just so you can't see the errors. But the size of his pages and also the detail of his ink work make me think that he was drawing at quite a large size. Either that or he's just extraordinarily precise in his work. But when you open it up, it's almost immersive, like you put your face close enough to those Fantagraphic books, which I think are pretty close to the size that it was originally printed. I might be wrong about that, but I think that's
they're about
close.
Half the size.
Okay. And it feels pretty immersive. Like it feels like it envelops your vision. And that's one of my curiosities now. Even this is a little bit off topic, so it's something we maybe can address later. But I'm wondering if outside of newspapers, if that's even something that can really be done that much anymore, is kind of those big, huge page concepts. But it is one of the things that's most attractive to me about Prince Valiant is the sense of having all this room to draw big, adventurous landscapes.
Yeah, I think it is interesting too. I mean, one of the things I think you notice as you read through the Fantagraphics, or just through the first year, is he really seems to start to expand out quite a bit. Like the first pages, especially when we haven't talked about this, but the story opens with Val in basically a swamp in England, the Fens. And that feels very, I mean, he's just doing kind of 4 panels, kind of 8 panels to a page, it seems like. But somewhere after that, kind of when he gets to Camelot, Foster really starts kind of opening up the panels a bit. It's not bad. It doesn't start, I mean, he's clearly a very fantastic draftsman, experienced artist when he's starting out. It's not bad or rough by any stretch of the imagination, but he starts creating much bigger scenes and kind of seeming to be arranging his compositions a bit more even kind of dynamically, or yeah, it's so he seems to really kind of even improve as it goes, and it's noticeable to me, at least, as you start reading through this.
Yeah, he's dropping the panel count as you go because it starts off in kind of that at least 12 area. And then he moves on into more often a 9-panel grid or something like that, but also emptying some area out of the center or along the edges or at the top and using that for broader landscape work, which that to me is just probably the effect of he starts off doing these strips. He sees them in the newspaper and sees what they actually look like. Because there's all that guesswork first of what does this actually look like on the page? Is this too big? Is this too small? You just don't know until you actually do it. And then you start adjusting your method to sort of keep up with the reality of how it's actually manifesting. At least that's my assumption, just based upon what I've seen happen in my own and other illustrators' work is as you see it in reality, you realize what's possible and what's not, and you're far more conservative at the beginning.
Yeah.
And
that makes sense.
He seemed to have a kind of well, like his development, I think, as an artist seems to be partially him just realizing how free he is on the newspaper page. Because before doing Valiant, he had this sort of adaptation of Tarzan that was wildly popular. And I've looked at the strips and they're good, but they're done basically the way that the earliest comics of Prince Valiant are, where it's sort of, it's not, I wouldn't call any of it that I've seen at least artistically daring. Whereas even in the first year, you start to have these huge images of castles or of like exciting feats that Val is undertaking, and it just becomes this like really exciting thing to read, especially I think as a little kid, but even as an adult who's sort of attentive to the work that's going into this. Like it's just so impressive what he's able to do with that canvas.
Yeah, particularly to me, I think I included this in our show notes, but there's a page where him and Gawain come to Camelot. I think it's Gawain, yeah, and he's doing things that really would not be possible a couple decades later, in comics, as far as just this he's breaking up the page. He has this incredible kind of opening, and the panels are all just very kind of unique size. I mean, it'd be really until you get to almost like Calvin and Hobbes that you see someone, that you see people able to do this, kind of have this kind of freedom in the comics page again, because by the time you hit the 60s and even like kind of late 50s, they started shrinking things down, trying to cut space. They didn't have as big a canvas to work in, and really started to constrain the artists. But I mean, it's an incredible, I mean, you could easily hang this on your wall as an illustration.
Yeah, I think it is tough. Like it's sort of in a way tragic to look back at Valiant because this could not exist today in anything like its current form. It would just be like newspapers don't give support to artists in any way. And I mean, I can understand why, right? Like it's not as though newspaper sales are through the roof. But also Foster's work was sort of so standout that he was one of the only. Actually, I think by the end, he was the only artist given this much space. So he got to keep this, like that size canvas until I think it was 79,
Oh,
which
wow.
Think of other comics being published in the 70s, like Peanuts at the time. Already the Sunday strip was a pretty small thing, more space than a daily, but that's not saying much. But it basically was until he sort of was semi-retired and handed on most of the duties to his assistant that they sort of shrank it down.
Jordan, one of the things I'd be interested to hear you talk about, because I've been following kind of your experimentation with coloring, I think has been very interesting to watch, because you're moving from I'd say kind of a digital toolkit in your illustration to a traditional toolkit.
Yes.
And what do you think of kind of how does kind of Foster's work there? Is it helpful? Do you find it inspiring? What are your thoughts on his work?
It's relentlessly warm, which is strange, I guess, because I mean it's set in England, right? And it
Right.
starts off with him up in these English fens, these swamps, and it feels way more like Florida or South Georgia, which is where my mom's family's from South Georgia, so I've been down there. It feels a lot like that to me. And so one of the probably the criticisms I have of his art style, and this is due in part to the limitations of the kind of the technical limitations that he was dealing with, as opposed to necessarily his exact set of choices. Because this is what all sort of pulp comics were colored like. They tended to be relentlessly warm and bright, but it exceeds some of the control of the mood. But at the same time, with the tools he's working with, I'm looking through some of the samples you put in the document as well, and remembering some of this. He has a far more subtle coloring technique, and he utilizes white space a lot to really kind of push your
Mm-hmm.
eye towards areas of color. And so it's really beautiful to look at. It just has never felt particularly English to me when I look at it, because it's
Yeah.
so intensely warm. But one thing I do appreciate about his color in particular is he does make the Middle Ages look bright and colorful. Which, granted, he's pulling visually more from like the 14th and 15th century than he is from the actual Arthurian period. But it's a lot better than the sort of mid 2000s decision that the medieval ages or the Middle Ages in general were just gray and sad and dirt smudged.
Yeah.
And this has certainly a brighter, more civilized look to it. It feels, in some ways, because I'm a big Italophile. I love Italian history and culture. It has a very Italian feel to it, sort of a Renaissance feel,
Mm.
bright, flashy colors, etc. So I like the energy of it, but I think I regret less even about Hal Foster, but just the limitations of the time in terms of color to be able to create more moody, colder, softer environments. Because I love the blue, purple, red scheme, and
Mm.
he basically doesn't really utilize that, and I think that's because it doesn't pair nearly as nicely with white space and a few other technical limitations.
It's funny. So
Yeah.
go ahead, Levi.
Go ahead, Felix.
As someone who's not an artist, I wouldn't have been able to articulate that anywhere near as well. But I had sort of noticed that about the brightness of the colors. And every once in a blue moon, you'll have a story where, you're not particularly in this volume, but some of the later years where, Val is encountering some sort of bad guy or in an evil castle or something, and you get some of those darker colors. And
I
I'm
think
always
the
really
ogre
struck
sequence
by
in this is a bit more moody.
yeah,
If
yeah,
you
that's a
remember
little
that.
bit more. Yeah. And like those are often things that really stick out to me, but they're so rare. And I do think that's sort of a loss. I also really am impressed by Foster's use of white space to prevent what's going on from just being like chaotic and messy and busy.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are some of these scenes where you'll have literally like 50 figures in it, or just tons of small people, this and that, in different colored clothing, in different kind of like levels of wealth and poverty, and it could really easily be this sort of overwhelming experience, particularly given his more sort of realistic style. But I think because of his use of white space, he's able to, right, which is sort of necessitated because of the structure of the comic, which we'll get to, right, that it's not speech bubbles, it's big chunks of text basically. But that use of white space, I think, like draws your eyes in a much more pleasing way. Yeah, and that's just really impressive to me because that does not seem like something that would just happen intuitively. I think that's something that he worked really hard at to do so well, and already was doing so well in this first year.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
design. That's the skill of design. He's figuring out how to compose the panel in a way to create a hierarchy of visuals so that he can move your eye throughout the panel in the chronology and the sequence that he wants it to move. And he's generally very good at this, even in very complex panels. And he uses white a lot to aid in that effort.
We're about half an hour into the conversation, so we might want to start turning a little bit more like concretely to the comics of the first year. But first, I might just sort of say a moment. I think I generally find it interesting to look at the biography of the author, but I think in this case, particularly with these early strips, it's sort of especially interesting because Val, right? Val and Hal have two of the same three letters, I think not accidentally. The young Val really is a character who's very reminiscent of the young Foster. And I think the early strips particularly were deeply influenced by Foster's life. So he's Canadian. His I think mother was American, father was Canadian. Father grew up like an hour and a half from where I live in Montreal, but Hal was born in Nova Scotia, in Halifax. Spent a lot of his young life outdoors, and Halifax was this harbor town. Foster was just enchanted by the sea, but not in this like sort of really removed romantic way. He was on it all the time. No, he by the time he was 10, he was like sailing a 30-foot boat by himself. And, like was also aware of how sort of dangerous this stuff was because he had a grandfather who was in this huge boat explosion. But yeah, like Foster was just always exploring. And I think I think you get a lot of that in these early strips where it's just this like young boy adventuring through the fens, just like seeing these wetlands and discovering things, and there are dragons and monsters and whatever. Yeah, and I don't know, I just think there's this kind of like childlike adventurousness and wonder that Foster brings to the strip that I think is probably connected, Jordan, to the kind of sincerity you were talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. As you watch the early development of the character of Val, he starts off with adventuring just for play. And then this sort of leads into competition. And then it leads into actually saving people and saving his own life. And then that expands out into him becoming a squire. There's this steady growth of how one of these things sort of leads to the other. It's almost like him imparting what he thinks it takes for a boy to become a man. There's this kind of
Yeah.
knowledge of that kind of natural growth and telling his own story through this vehicle to encourage the adventurous spirit in children, especially in boys. And I think that stood out to me just because it is kind of rare. You don't encounter a lot of that now, but at the time, this was something that I think was far more common. And this is kind of like a great example of that tendency to foster the adventurous spirit intentionally using
Yeah.
narrative.
Yeah, I was thinking about this recently because so my sister we live up sort of in the Adirondacks, and my sister lives in another state now, but she every year brings a bunch of families who are, friends of hers to this little camp nearby that sort of rents cabins very, very cheaply. And so they'll have kind of a make your own family camp. And this year I brought up a bunch of comics for them, so like some Barks Uncle Scrooge and some, early 60s Peo Smurf and Tintin and Astro Boy and a bunch of different things that sort of kids would glom onto. And they all just loved it. Like anytime it was raining or half the time when it wasn't, they were just poring over these comics. And two of the parents were sort of asking me for recommendations for comics for kids. And I was going through them, and and I sort of said like I think like every 10-year-old boy should have access to the first like 10 or 20 years of Prince Valiant, because it's just this, like you said, this initiation into, I think, an approach to growth, particularly for young men. I think women too, but particularly young men. There is this sort of growth in competence and a sort of venturing out into the unknown, and sort of confronting fears that's just done in a really compelling and powerful way, particularly in a way I think that young boys are naturally attracted to. Because you just like see the way that they play. I mean, even so, my boys are only 3 and 1, but already they have this like desire, if there's a place that's a little too high for them, or like something that's a little too hard for them to climb, like that's the first thing they're going to in a room, or outside when they see something that's going to challenge them and make them grow. uh and I think it is really important for us, pardon the pun, but to foster this the way that these comics do. I don't know, it's just really well done. Yeah. But I don't know if, Levi, you have anything to sort of add before I talk like a little bit more about the sort of historical background. Okay. So his dad, Foster's dad, died when he was pretty young, and so he had to mostly quit school in order to get money, mainly from hunting. And Hal's mom offhandedly commented that it was a shame he'd never get an education, and Hal just responds, "The hell I won't." And he spent like a massive amount of his free time in the library and was really kind of an autodidact. And I think we see this in Val in the strip, that there is this a kind of like impetuousness and sort of temper, but also this like real desire to learn and grow and explore. Yeah, and he had like just a bunch of different jobs. He was a boxer for a while, and he had a job as a stenographer for a bit. His boss criticized him, saying that he's, like, you seem to think hunting is more important than business. And the 18-year-old Foster just said yes, and then lost his job. But it was like just this crazy young life. He like was shot by a drunkard and had like buckshot in his leg for the rest of his life. And one of my favorite stories is that he taught himself to draw the human form. Like, he was a teenager trying to figure it out, and he would draw himself naked in front of the mirror in order to like figure out sort of how you do the human form in different poses. But like Canadian winters are very cold, and there was not good heating, and so he like said that was how he learned to draw quickly, because he was just getting so cold. And so that's why he's able to do these like really massive scenes with so many figures in a pretty realistic way, is because he got so good at doing this really quickly. And he we can talk sort of future episodes sort of about some of his later life, but just this one other sort of like adventurous thing is that when he wanted to move from Canada to America, he took this massive bike ride, like a few thousand miles, largely over unpaved roads, and just like paths and things to go down to, I want to say, Chicago. And like he didn't even know if there was a job on the other end. He was going down there to see, like, can I get a job here? It turned out he could, and then eventually, like, he biked back to come and like get his family. Yeah, but it just, and I do think like the sort of historical point of like the person who wrote this was growing up in a really different time, right? It was over a century ago now. And there was this kind of adventurousness baked into a lot of ways of life that I think oftentimes today, those elements are sort of really intentionally removed. And I think that like works like this can be really good for giving kids and parents like a sense that no, this kind of like adventurousness should be encouraged.
I often think that about these authors from this era, particularly the authors that were kind of formed in the shadow of like World War I and World War II. Some of them fought in World War II. You think about people like, especially kind of later Marvel artists and stuff. And you would think that instead, they would have incredibly cynical, grim output, right? The vision of the world that they would impart would be really tainted by their, the first half of the 20th century is about as brutal as you can possibly get, to be alive. And yet they kind of have the opposite, where they try to, the world they present in their creations is anything but that. And I think it's a very odd twist that it takes until the next generation comes along, where you start seeing, creators like, your Frank Millers, your Alan Moores, who have this like relentlessly cynical, deconstructive view of the world. And they actually weren't particularly involved in those conflicts that you would think would give you that. So it is odd to me. And it hasn't really, we haven't seemed to be able to shake that approach and kind of recapture the outlook that these other creators had.
And that's particularly striking to me, given that a lot of other art forms had a kind of immediate like disillusionment, right? Like you think of a lot of poetry and novels in the post-war period, but comics kept a lot of this sort of sense of wonder, I think, longer. And we're also, right, people sort of talking kind of a crass way about vibe shift, but I think on a deeper level, our art, and this is by no means a sort of original statement, but I think our art in the last decade or so has been sort of maybe a little bit more been kind of re-embracing sincerity after a really long period of initially kind of like pessimism and then kind of like irony and even sort of nihilism. And I think we're, and I want us to see more works like this. And I'm wondering sort of if that turn is happening in comics yet, or if it's still just like it's like the sort of comics turn towards this kind of darkness initially took longer than in other art forms. I wonder if it will take a little bit longer on this end to kind of turn towards the sort of neo sincerity that would be echoing something like a Valiant. I don't know. That's sort of speculative, but something I'd hope for, I guess.
Maybe something with a little bit more, I was trying to think of a good way, a little more mysticism to it. Prince Valiant is relatively sanitized of spirituality. It has magic, but it's kind of like a predecessor to Dungeons and Dragons magic, where it's really more of like a skill set or something that's utilized within the world. You can see kind of like early fantasy emerging in that way. And if you take something and read it like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, as it was originally sort of written down in, I think, the 12th or 13th century, I can't remember exactly. It, of course, is rife with spiritual content. In fact, the whole thing sort of revolves around it. So it's noticeable to me that Prince Valiant, while it has this kind of great sincerity about it and wants to promote this sense of adventure because it views that as a value, it's also doing something that most media from the early 20th century does, which is try to take a step back from a spiritual context in order to expand the audience. At least that's the sense that you get. And in anything that was broad mass media at the time, there's usually a kind of retreat from spirituality except its effects, which is kind of where you get the magic, sort of the sorcerer, the wizard, the Merlin, etc., without it being attached to some kind of explanation of that force and explanation
Yeah.
of that presence.
Yeah, because I think Foster is relatively respectful of kind of Christianity whenever it comes up. And there's a sort of later book in which Val goes to the Holy Land and Foster would never draw a real place until he had been there. Because he wanted to be able to depict it properly, which is just extremely cool to me. But and when he depicts the Holy Land, he does sort of show it in a sort of semi-reverential way, but Foster himself, I think, he was respectful of religion, but he was not a religious man, really. And there is, I think, obviously sort of a loss there, right? That when you empty out virtues of a kind of objective, transcendent referent, it's very easy within a couple generations for them to degrade from virtues into values and become this very sort of wishy-washy and subjective thing rather than something claimed about like actual growth of the human being and sort of becoming more oneself and these sorts of like richer ideas that have a kind of metaphysical resonance rather than a purely kind of like ethical and political one. Yeah, and I would love to see something like a Prince Valiant that had like a slightly stronger kind of spiritual bent to it, not in a kind of saccharine way. And I'm not even quite sure what this would look like. There are these old.
Well, I mean, you could read. I mean, like if you think about like it is set in the Arthurian kind of world, which is I mean, that's a very interesting time. I think C.S. Lewis, right, maybe talks about this in I mean, in That Hideous Strength, where you have, for those who haven't read it, but Merlin makes an appearance, but they do remark on this that the like Le Morte d'Arthur is an odd in all the Arthurian kind of literature is odd because you have characters like Merlin, the ladies of the lake wandering around who are kind of pagan, but they're also Arthur is clearly a Christian king. And, Merlin, I think is a Christian too. So you have this kind of, they're coming from a time where these things are somewhat blending or being replaced. One, paganism is being replaced, but there's still these strange figures kind of wandering around in the woods and lakes of England. And it is much more interesting, I think, to approach those. And we've talked about, kind of the innocence and credulity of Valiant, but it does have kind of the 1950s modernist kind of worldview to some degree when it approaches those subjects, which the literature that it's actually pulling from doesn't really have.
Yeah, it certainly isn't something that's critical of religion. And if you look at cinema from that period, it is kind of the same pattern. There's kind of this tip of the hat respect that's kind of offered, but then it's just kind of generally sanitized of those things to kind of remove the foundational aspect of them, where this kind of stands at the root. And so in the hope to see that reemergence, yeah, definitely want to avoid the saccharine. But I think in order to do that, contemporary writers, and this is me thinking about my own work here, yeah, you really do have to go back to the sources that were writing from that time period and try to wrap your mind around the way they think. And there is a lot of syncretism from England during the Arthurian period, whether Arthur existed or not. During that Arthurian period, there's a lot of syncretism with this kind of Druid religion that exists in that area. There's the Anglo-Saxons who carry their own sort of Nordic Scandinavian religion into the island. And then you still have even a few Roman remnants, like elements of the original Roman Britons who still have some Roman pagan elements. It is the strangest island in the world. And so when I do read something and it kind of takes away or sanitizes is a better word, that spiritual aspect, that's one of the things I would love to see explored, keeping what Prince Valiant does so well, which is that sense of adventure, the rich illustrative art, making it the Middle Ages feel like a real world. But at the same time, there's plenty of ground that just hasn't been explored. And there's plenty of room to explore it for artists. And I mean, for heaven's sake, let's just read Dante and look at how to do spirituality in literature as well as any human being has ever done it. Because that's obviously rife with that. But yeah, that whole period, if you read them, you get a sense of a different way of talking about faith that is not something that is a pure pitch, which I think is what we got into with most Christian media throughout the latter half of the 20th century. It's just it's a pitch, it's a sales pitch. It's like going and sitting down and listening to a timeshare pitch or something like that. It has all the fun and enjoyment and pressure of that. Instead, weaving it in to a narrative so that it's just inextricable from that narrative. The way that faith is meant to be woven into the life, in which it becomes inextricable from the life and not some sequestered, compartmentalized version of faith and life lived parallel. The narrative has the ability to do that, but it definitely requires reading and thinking about things that do not come from the last 50 to 100 years, but looking further back and trying to get a sense of storytelling that we've somewhat lost.
Strikingly, I think as faith has been kind of removed from a lot of this conversation, so have a lot of hard edges, right? Like you were kind of talking about the syncretism, right? There's a sort of like strangeness, right? And like Levi was bringing up, like Merlin is a really weird figure. Like Merlin was a succubus who was like born basically a demon and then baptized and then like spend his life in service to a Christian king. Like that's a really weird figure. I mean, also like connectedly, right? There's a kind of like Christianity without the crucifixion. There's this loss of the kind of violence inherent in Christianity. But I mean, even in sort of religion more broadly, right? I think traditional religion confronts pain and suffering and evil really intensely in a way that oftentimes art that now wants to engage with religion just sort of fails to.
I guess the question I have, is how do you guys think Foster does as a, kind of continuing the Arthurian tradition of storytelling, I guess? Do you think this is a success, or should it be just viewed kind of as it's more of a, maybe like a pastiche of, of certain stuff? I wonder how much he actually, absorbed that literature, or if it just was more of a fun setting to send Val off on adventures without really deeply, connecting with the source material.
Well, myths have something of a quality of mystery to them, right? So you can look at it from 1,000 different angles and extract something of value from each of those angles. It's kind of like if you take a bunch of Last Supper paintings and you look at all of them, they're all quite different from each other. Like there's a Tintoretto piece that differs greatly from the famous Da Vinci piece of the Last Supper. But if you look at them, they seem to contain explorations of things that would be true about the Last Supper, but you couldn't get them both in one painting. So this Prince Valiant exploration of the Arthurian tale, being that myths are very much like this, they're kind of these massive stories that you can dig into from any possible angle, and you'll pull something forward that's of extraordinary value, even if it does not contain everything that could be pulled. And that's how I kind of view this when I've got my criticisms of it a little bit, which I've already stated, but in reality, I think it is capturing a very poignant part of the Arthurian tale, which is venture out, test yourself, be challenged, survive, keep, these kinds of things that are deeply human aspects of life that lead us to success, but they lead us through danger to success. They lead us through trials to success. And I think he does a wonderful job of doing that. So I appreciate a great deal this aspect of Arthur. And I think he saw that aspect of it clearly, even if I think other parts were somewhat lost.
I think, Jordan brought up Dante's comedy earlier. I think of the role that Odysseus plays, called Ulysses in it, because Dante did not. So Dante like knew Virgil and the Aeneid extremely well. Dante did not have access to the Iliad and the Odyssey, and so his sort of vision of Odysseus and or Ulysses is very different from ours, I think. But what he does with Ulysses is actually is really engaging with something very real about that story, or at the very least is engaging with something very real about human nature. And so even if it's not something that Homer necessarily would have recognized precisely. And this is, I think, the kind of tradition of engagement with Ulysses that Tennyson is picking up on in his Ulysses. I haven't read Joyce because it's too long and complicated, and so I can't comment on that. But well, I've started it and then sort of petered off. But I do think that's it's not even just an okay thing for artists to do. I think it's necessarily something artists are doing, right? Because as we sort of help to mold traditions and encounter them and kind of are inspired by aspects of them, there's no possibility of continuing the exact same thing. It's necessarily going to be something different. So a more contemporary example would be The Mandalorian, the first two seasons. So I have all the same criticism everyone else does of the vast majority of sort of Disney's Star Wars output. I think the first two seasons of The Mandalorian are excellent. They are picking up on very real parts of what Star Wars is doing. They're picking up on these sort of samurai legends and a lot of different ideas, but they're also not engaging with the kind of spiritual ideas of the Force, and they're not engaging really with the kind of young man growing into maturity, which is, I would say, kind of at the beating heart of episodes 4 through 6 of Star Wars. And yet they are telling this great story, right? That is really compelling and doesn't feel contradictory to the original in a way that some of the other spin-off material, I think episode 8 feels like a rebuke of the original Star Wars, right? It feels like sort of an insult to this tradition. I mean, obviously it's a tradition in a very different sense than something like Arthurian legend, but let's just call it a tradition in a way that The Mandalorian, the first couple of seasons feel like a really fruitful inspiration by an engagement with and sort of molding of some piece of it. So I would say something similar about Prince Valiant, I think. So I would agree with Jordan's take that even though it's missing or even sort of denuded of a few aspects that I care very deeply about in the Arthurian legend, it is engaging with so much of what makes Arthurian legend so powerful and profound and morally meaningful. And so I think it is just this really excellent kind of 20th century work that's sort of broadly in that tradition.
Can I maybe bring up one thing that I think with our remaining time left here, I think that we haven't really talked about, but one of the things about Prince Valiant is that makes it unique as a comic is it doesn't it's presented, I think, more as an illustrated story. It doesn't use speech bubbles. It actually relies totally on narration. And I guess this, if I was to raise any criticism, but I'll throw it out there. I won't bring up my opinion so much. But what do you guys think of Foster's actual prose as he writes this story?
It's efficient. I feel like as I'm reading it, he's really fighting with word count. He's trying to keep the word count as low as he possibly can while still evoking some of it. I mean, he's definitely got some decoration to the language. So it's not pure efficiency, but it's relatively efficient, and a lot of times it is a little redundant to the artwork. And this is one of the criticisms that you get in screenwriting all the time: is voiceover should never ever say what's happening on screen. It should provide a different perspective on what's happening on screen or something like that. And so a lot of this operates a little bit like that. It is a narrator who's talking about it. And when it has a picture of him seeing a castle at the end of the marsh, and it says, and then he sees far out in the marsh the sinister castle, something like that, you could probably rework that narration a little bit. But in general, I actually am very fond of the way that it's told, because it feels a little bit like sitting at like the grandfather's knee and having the story told to you. It has a little bit of that quality to it, and I like that. But it's a really interesting limitation, because it feels a lot like a limitation to not use speech balloons or anything of that kind at all. Never using them, at least not that I've seen. Maybe he utilizes them later on, but this is an interesting limitation to set upon yourself, especially when it seems like he's trying to save space with text, but also he put some text in here that is really kind of unnecessary at the same time.
Yeah.
Levi and regular listeners will know that I am a huge defender of the caption box. I think it can, when done well, be like, even when it is giving redundant information, it can be a huge sort of scene setter and can be really determinative of the reader's like attitude to the approach as they approach part of a story. I also think it's interesting being married to a woman who is not a natural comic reader, because she, like, when she glides her eyes across a page, she's an excellent reader. She was like reading Jane Eyre at 8 years old, and like is this great writer and yada yada, much smarter than I am in various ways. But like when she read, like a lot of the time when she picks up a comic, she just doesn't understand the motion of what's going on in an intuitive way. And I can kind of like point it to her and sort of mansplain each piece, but it just doesn't happen naturally for her. And so like I do think when you consider how wide the audience for this was, having it be really accessible to someone who is not kind of naturally picking out all of the important pieces of the scene. We haven't read any, so I just sort of flipped open to a random page of something we read for this episode, and I'm just going to read it out loud, because every comic, right, begins with this little synopsis of what's going on. The tournament of the Queen's Diamonds on Winchester Heath is halted as Prince Valiant and the swooning Sir Gawain ride up to King Arthur's pavilion, and the adventure of the ransom plot is finished. This was but a mild adventure, and it was necessary to kill only 7 enemies in the way of business. The only serious happening was the wounding of Sir Gawain. And like, is that the best way of structuring things grammatically? Is he more evoking a kind of 20th century vision of old-timey speech than of like the actual way either like Latin or English, Middle English prose about Arthurian legend would have been? Sure. But I think it works.
I think it works.
Yeah.
For me, I think I would just say the biggest pet peeve I have with Prince Valiant, I think, is Foster's, and it's not so bad in the early ones, but it really starts to assert itself, I feel like, in later volumes when things get even more romantic, is he kind of has this winking voice that he takes on, of like, where it's like he's kind of like nudging you a little bit when he's writing, like, like there's a few examples of this where he'll be like, Val promotes himself to guard duty.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like his prose gets a little too pleased with itself sometimes, I feel like. I don't know. That would be my one drawback here, is considering his level of just artistic giftedness. the writing is not quite equal to what's actually on the page.
I think that's fair. And also, I mean, you'd have to have an astonishing level of skill as a writer to be matching what's on the page as a draftsman also. So, I don't know. Like the writing is good enough that I enjoy the story, and the art is just sort of continually breathtaking. So it's sort of like if art is 11 out of 10, the fact that the writing is, 7.5 or something is fine for me.
That's why I try to be mediocre at both.
Right. Then you aren't comparing the
Nobody
two.
can ever see the distance.
We should talk a little bit sort of about the actual plot of what we read for those who are sort of listening but haven't yet read, but I hope you will.
Cool. All right. So digging into actually the summary of what the first
After an
year
hour of
is.
conversation.
Yeah. This first year, yeah. So as we've been talking, this is obviously in the age of King Arthur, and it starts. Prince Valiant seems like what, like 12? Is he a baby when this happens? He's pretty young.
I think of him as being like 8 in the first week and maybe 10 in the second,
Yeah.
and then up to 12 for a while.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
So his father, a king of Thule, from the far north, not I would assume somewhere in like not Scandinavia, but maybe the
I think it's
Norway
supposed
or
to be
something.
Norway, but I have no idea.
Yeah.
It's not made that clear to me.
Yeah. They're deposed, and so they flee in a boat to Britain, and they end up kind of setting up a kingdom in the wetlands, where his first adventure, he ventures out into the marshes, meets a witch named Horit, who tells Val's future, prophesying you're confronting a unicorn, the dragon, the griffin, black men in yellow. You'll have high adventure, but nowhere do I see happiness and contentment. And already your greatest sorrow awaits you. And returning home, he finds his mother has died. That's kind of Act 1, setting the scene for what is to come. But this is a relatively early point in Val's adventures.
I think it's really effective. This, I mean, it's short, it's small. It probably takes like 3 months of strips, but it's like it pulled me in completely the first time I read it. And then rereading it this time, it did the exact same thing. Like I care, even though Val is not this sort of like deeply complicated figure or something, I'm pulled into his story right away. I don't know. What did you two find there?
I enjoyed the introduction quite a bit. The only thing that I didn't really connect to as much was the environment of kind of the swamps and fens there at the beginning. It just lacked sort of vertical height, and I just wanted to see castles right away. So maybe that was just immaturity or something like that. But there is a narrative element here that is in the Aeneid, which is the royal person, or at least the high-ranking person, who is separated from the homeland and forced to start over. And that to me is a very appealing narrative hook. I like that idea a lot. It comes up throughout literature with reasonable
Knight of
frequency,
Cups.
and it gives a sense of there's a destiny that I ought to have, but now I've got to claim it for myself. It's not just going to be handed to me. So I think that's a great hook. It pulled me in right away as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a really resonant one today. Oh, go ahead, Levi.
I was just going to say, one of the things that I think Foster is definitely retaining from Arthurian legend is the fact that if you're noble, you have a destiny kind of placed upon you, and so the fact that Val is a prince, that he comes from a noble lineage, in Arthurian literature, that means you've got, you're almost an ontologically different sort of person than someone who is not nobly born. And yeah.
Prince Valiant decides to leave the fens, venturing onto land, where he breaks a horse, begins adventuring. He meets several knights, including Gawain, travels to Camelot with him, and becomes Gawain's sire. And he sort of starts to have adventures both in Camelot and without. So he gets to rescue Gawain from an evil baron's castle. And then just at sort of the end of the first year, he is sort of meeting an ogre, and there's this that there's more that we'll sort of get into in future episodes, but it's really sort of just starting, I think, to pick up as he kind of, as Jordan has indicated, kind of starts to develop his sphere of competence and concern and kind of venture out. But yeah, so that's kind of everything that happens broadly in the first year. So as a sort of first year of a strip, because we know a bit the direction it's going in, but how did you two sort of find it as active cartoonists? Sort of I don't know.
I was kind of wavering in and out, and this is one place where being a self-righteous nerd about the history, once Vikings start showing up and all these other things, I'm battling with the historical timeline. I keep thinking, when is this set? And then I realize that's not important. That's not the point that he's getting at. He's sort of compiling these narratives together. In the big thrust of what happens in each of these, it's usually about Val's self-reliance. Like, it always ends up coming down to him having to come up with some creative solution to a problem of sorts. And then also, it's something where he actually does seem to struggle. Like, there is real difficulty in accomplishing some things. And I think it might be a little bit after this, but there's also some failure involved as well, where, he's kind of struggling. He runs into something, doesn't do well, and then has to change his tactic in some way. So I think it was good storytelling. It's really different. As I was reading, I was thinking about how hard this is for anybody who's accustomed to modern comics to go back and read. It's just really different stuff. It's not like a novel. It's much more of an overview of a narrative. It only zooms in on the occasional moment, but it covers more ground in half a page than your average like floppy comic book does now in 20 pages, something like that. There's a lot of narrative ground that gets covered.
And frankly, I sort of enjoy that pace of storytelling. So if we have the sort of average pace, average writer doing this kind of pace, and average writer doing the sort of contemporary Marvel or DC pace, I prefer this. Because it is hard. There are people like Bendis who really can do that slow pace in a super effective way, but I think it's really hard. Levi, any sort of closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think probably for me, you're right, Jordan, that this is an odd pacing wise. Most of the, the challenges that he'll encounter are kind of resolved within, a page or 3, 4, maybe at the most. Seems like there's not a lot of long running conflict that isn't quickly addressed. So and part of me was like, I feel like Val is somewhat overcompetent for someone at his age. You kind of want to see him struggle more and maybe grow more. But then I wonder, why do I want that? Because that seems to be a hang up that writers at this time did not necessarily have as much as modern writers do, where it's like you have to make your character like an utter idiot at the beginning, and they have to, everyone's telling you, build an arc for your character. So, and there's pleasure in that, in watching a character grow and become mature and become competent. But it is a very modern hangup. I feel like I recognize, like, particularly in the last, 50 years or something. Whereas, even as a kid, I would love like the Hardy Boys, for example, are like the first novels I read as a kid, and they do not grow as characters and change. They're ridiculously competent and they stay that way. So I wonder, maybe this is just me being like just overly formed by the modern world or something. I don't know.
I think a little bit of yes, a little bit of no, because again, he does struggle some, so there is some balance thrown in there. But yeah, generally not. Generally, he's capable. But character growth, you can find that in a lot of great literature way, way back. If you read the first, because I mentioned Dante earlier, if you read the first few cantos of Inferno, once they're actually down into the Inferno, he does not yet know how to admonish the sinner properly, and so he has to learn how to do that the right way, and Virgil helps him do that. And then, of course, at the end of Purgatorio, he's at the top of the mountain, and he's had his will corrected, and so he's now kind of released out into making his own decisions. So, and again, I mentioned Gawain in the Green Knight earlier too. That's a huge character growth development arc as well. So I think it's a great aspect of storytelling. We probably do obsess over it too much now, when I think it's probably something that could be done relatively intuitively. And you definitely don't have to go all the way down to absolute idiot. There just has to be, some growth, some change, I think, to help with that. And when I read this one, I do see some of that, because again, his trials start smaller and get bigger. So there is at least that aspect thereof, where we see some character growth and change. Although I could easily see somebody making the argument that he's a Mary Sue and that he is completely capable of everything on the first try.
Yeah, and I do think it's important to say that like there are different kinds of stories that can be valuable. Right? There are these sort of tales of like moral growth or even just moral like confrontation, right? Like I don't know that Achilles necessarily grows over the course of the Iliad. Well, no, he probably does. Okay, but there are examples I could come up with, I'm sure, of figures who like I wouldn't describe what they're doing as growing in sort of ancient literature, but they are sort of changing or at least confronting really interesting things. But like there's also, I don't know, so I think of like Al Wiseman's Dennis the Menace comics from the 50s and 60s. Like they're amazing. They're like 5 out of 5, 10 out of 10, whatever. They're just phenomenal comics. Dennis is not generally growing in them. Mostly he's just like going to Hawaii and like doing ridiculous things on a plane. And I think because of films and because of Joseph Campbell, we often end up thinking about characters and stories in a kind of like very mechanistic way where it's like, oh, they have to sort of start in this kind of a place and have this kind of emotion and the sort of teacher figure and the initial failure, yada yada, the rejection of the call, whatever. And I think there's something to it, and I think it makes for quite good movies. Like The Lion King, really good movie. Star Wars, really good movies. But it's not clear to me that, particularly for longer running works that well. Like I think of Doctor Who. Doctor Who is one of my favorite shows, and he has character arcs at various times, but they don't fit into that. And I don't think it's a bad show because of that. And I also think like remembering that this was not published as a book like this. It was published as a weekly comic. And so it wanted to tell a story that excited you on that one page and hopefully has like a little bit of satisfaction and then has you come back for the next. And I think over the course of long periods of time, like to read a whole year or two actually is really enjoyable. But also like it was originally you're reading it one week and then waiting for next week's. And that is, I think, important in thinking about it as a work of art and as a story about a character. Yeah, yeah. So I would sort of put that on the table, I guess.
Yeah, I hear that. And I think that's always a challenge with weekly comics. Like I wouldn't say Calvin grows as a character or Hobbes, but also Foster is seeming to tell a story where Val is growing. He starts off younger, he gets older, and he's moving, he's expanding his horizons and things like that. So it is a little less of like a gag a week kind of thing. Like you wouldn't expect Crazy Cat to really grow his characters. They're like fixed in amber. I think he gets better at this, I will say. And we, we're not talking about future issues, but I think there are more like I think of like the courtship of Alita. Is that who ends up being Val's wife? Where you get these longer drawn out kind of conflicts, and we see it's and maybe this is just the audience, right? Like, what is the most challenging thing? It's when a girl shows up that you like, as opposed to that's a real thing that's going to test Val's.
Dragons are nothing.
Yeah, fighting knights all day is easy. So it's probably the audience to some degree as well.
We could keep talking, but we should probably close. Want to give Jordan just like a minute to give a little ad for some of his work and his Patreon that everybody should sign up for?
Sure. You can find me online just by searching J. Holt, the illustrator. Last name's Holt. You can find me anywhere on mostly Twitter and YouTube, but I've got stuff up all over the place. It's easy to find. And I've got a website called Carthage Workshop where I sell the Theseus books and a card game that I illustrated that's Greek mythology, etc. I called it Carthage because Carthage, I feel like, is one of those ancient worlds that's kind of lost that we don't really have a lot of information on. So in the effort to try and keep the classical and historical world alive, that's where I'm putting historical graphic novels and games and things like that. And you'll find a link on there because I am working on a graphic novel that's set in Anglo-Saxon England. Specifically, it's set in 793. That one is in process, and I've got a Patreon for it for anybody who wants to watch that process unfold as far as how a graphic novel like that gets researched, written, and created over the course of what's probably going to take me 4 years. That's my estimation right now. So the illustration of that really kind of starts at the beginning of next year. And right now I'm researching and writing most of it as I go. So That's me. You can find me there, and feel free to reach out if you have interest in these things and want to conversate about it. My college professor background makes me like to talk about things.
Great. All right. So, and also I should mention, I don't think it will be over by the time this episode drops, but maybe it will, that Levi has a Kickstarter going or about to go or will have just ended for a print run of his really genuinely excellent work, Open Your Eyes. So find those links on his social media too. But anyway, thank you everybody for listening. Kind of general content notes. Prince Valiant is appropriate for pretty much any age group. There's violence, but it isn't gory, and there's some witchcraft and wizardry if you're concerned about such things, but it isn't really the focus of the story. What are we doing next week, Levi?
Yeah, I think we'll be reading the Prince Valiant comics of 1938 and 1939, the rest of Fantagraphics Volume 1, and the first half of Volume 2.
All right, if you enjoyed this episode of Truth Beauty Comics, there are 3 things you can do for the podcast to support it. First is to keep listening and share it with your friends.
Second is to review the podcast, giving it 5 stars wherever you listen to us.
And the last thing you can do is consider contributing to our Patreon with a monthly donation. For as little as $3 a month, you can get perks like access to exclusive episodes, voting on topics for upcoming episodes, and even an original drawing from Levi. But most of all, you can help make this podcast sustain.
That's the end of the episode. You can reach us at truthbeautycomics@gmail.com or on our social media accounts. Thanks for listening, and remember to take comics seriously and have fun while doing it.